Welcome back. So I've been using iPhone 13 Pro for about 6 months now, and it's been a really good experience. Starting with the design, I think it looks really good. I like the squared off, more industrial look as opposed to the more rounded designs that we had in between the 4 and the 12. It's comfortable to hold, and I don't find it as slippery as like the more rounded designs. So if you're walking around with your phone just in your hand, especially without a case, you'll have a better grip on it. Personally, I'm not a fan of the shiny stainless steel rails. They pick up a ton of fingerprints and little micro scratches. I would have preferred the matte aluminum rails that you get on the regular iPhone 13, but I do really like the matte glass on the back, especially in this Sierra blue color. It almost feels like it changes color under different lighting situations, so you'll either have a darker looking phone or a lighter looking phone depending on where you are and what the lighting's like. Personally, I'm glad I went with Sierra blue over the graphite or silver, but seeing the mid-cycle refresh with the Alpine green is also a pretty good looking color. Also, the 13 Pro is a pretty dense feeling phone in your hand since it is a little bit thicker with a bigger battery over last year's models. And I'll talk about the actual battery life I've gotten off this phone in a bit, but that extra weight was definitely worth the amount of time that this thing lasts. Also on the back, there's the new camera system, which has some pretty interesting new hardware and software features. And I feel like most of them were geared towards better photos in low light situations since you have faster apertures for the wide and the ultra wide, and you now have night mode on the telephoto. And I think it worked. So I find myself pulling out my phone to take more photos in darker situations when I wouldn't usually. But this phone sometimes feels like it can see in the dark even if you're just in a pitch black situation or you have very little light. It'll still get something for your image, which is pretty impressive. But regardless of not having enough light or having even too much light out in the sun, I've always managed to get a pretty good image out of this camera. But I did notice that sometimes when I was shooting at night, using the telephoto, the phone would automatically switch back to the wide and digitally crop in 3 times rather than actually shooting at that 3x focal distance. But I guess that makes sense considering the wide can still let in so much more light with its faster aperture. So in the end, the photo probably would look better than whatever the telephoto is gonna end up with. Now on the hardware side, there were faster apertures for more light gathering. And on the software side, I think my favorite new feature is photographic styles. So if you're not shooting in RAW, you can actually choose a tone and a warmth level that you think fits your style the best and what you want straight out of camera. So the phone will take this and apply it to every photo, but intelligently. So when it takes a photo and it does its layering and it does all of its smart HDR and things like that, it'll apply these filters kind of at that level. So it's not a filter slapped on top, it's a filter that's put inside the stack of the image processing. And it does so without affecting skin tones. So if you up the warmth, you're not gonna end up with incredibly warm skin tones. They'll still look natural in your photos while everything else will look warm. I usually shoot in RAW, so I have a little bit more flexibility. I can take it into Lightroom or even make edits in the Photos app. But for like quick photos, when I wanna send a picture in Messages, or if I just need a quick photo of something, I usually have it set to the rich contrast default, which gives me a good amount of saturation and a good amount of contrast. I think the colors just look good. And those are just for photos. For video, you can now shoot in cinematic video, which is pretty much portrait mode, but in video. And it's pretty cool. You can change the aperture that it's emulating so you can adjust the level of blur you're getting. And even when you're done shooting after the fact and you're editing your video, you can change the subject of your video. So let's say you have 2 people in frame and it's focused on one while the other's blurred out. You can swap that. But I did find it to be pretty finicky, so you need a decent amount of light for it to work. If it gets too dark or if it is too dark, it just tells you I can't do it. And while it is really cool, I don't use it very often. I only really used it to test out and maybe a couple of times just for fun. I usually just use the camera that I'm using right now to get real blur. But it would be nice to be able to change focus later on while I'm editing. Personally, if I want to get really good video out of the iPhone, I just use the stock video mode on the stock camera app. I usually shoot at 4K 60 with the HDR turned on so I can preserve the highlights and the shadows. And I think it looks really good straight out of camera. I'll just cut it in with a Canon sometimes if I don't bring it with me and I need to record a clip. But if you're looking for a little bit more flexibility in post, you can also use the new ProRes feature for video. I haven't done that because I don't shoot in ProRes because of the fact that it takes insane amounts of storage. So if you're gonna shoot ProRes on your phone, just go for like the 1 terabyte one, be prepared to like burn through it in like 20 minutes. But I think my overall favorite feature of this new camera system has got to be the macro mode for the ultra wide camera. So hardware wise, they added the autofocus to the ultra wide camera, so now you can focus up to 2 centimeters away in both photo and video, which I think is really cool because you have that ultra wide field of view really close up to things. It reminds me a lot of the Laowa probe lens, since that's also a wide angle lens and you can get really up close to things. It's kind of like you're a bug walking through like larger objects, you're like a bug sitting on something. It looks really good. But I do wish there was a way to turn on macro mode and just leave it on, so I don't have to get up close to something and then wait for it to turn on and hope that it doesn't turn off when I move back or move around. I personally really like shooting macro. I even made an entire video about the Canon 100mm macro. So being able to pull out my phone when I don't have my camera with me with that incredibly heavy lens, it just opens the door for more shots I can get, for more scenarios that I can shoot in that I won't always have my camera with me. So it's nice that something I have is able to get that perspective. And this phone doesn't have features like 100x space zoom or recording in 8K like you'd find on other phones out there, but it does just give you really solid photos and really solid videos. So you could call the camera a little boring, but it is consistently performing well for me at least. So I'm fine with boring here. They're not trying to do too much to the point where it would compromise the quality of the base features that you'd want from your camera. But it is nice having such a solid camera that I can reliably trust with every shot, every video that I'm using it for, while it's super convenient to just put in my pocket when I'm done with it. And on the other side of the phone, we have the new ProMotion display, which brings high refresh rates to the iPhone, but it's also adaptive. So depending on what's happening on the screen at the time, the display is going to ramp its refresh rate anywhere from 10 to 120 times per second in an attempt to give you responsiveness when you need it, but also help conserve battery when you're just looking at like a static image or a wall of text. And I feel like it's kind of hard to see this higher refresh rate unless you put it next to an older iPhone that has 60 Hertz. Personally, I found iOS's animations to already be like pretty optimized and already pretty quick, so I recorded this at 120 frames per second to really show the big difference between 60 Hertz and 120 Hertz. But once I put them side by side, I did notice that 120 is really nice to have. I really enjoyed scrolling text. It doesn't turn into a blur, it still stays pretty sharp as you're scrolling, so I can read it while I scroll. And also the already quick animations, like I mentioned, are just a little bit quicker and a little bit snappier, especially when you unlock the phone or you're launching an app. It's also a fairly bright screen. Like when you're out in the sun, you can see it pretty easily, but I do wish it got a little bit dimmer. Like the lowest setting of the brightness would just make it a lot darker than it really is. I feel like a phone screen that could get dimmer than what the iPhone does now would be really nice for like using your phone at night or just in any darker environment. Also, the screen has the new smaller notch that I should mention, but it isn't like smaller in the ways that I care about. It's a little bit smaller horizontally, but honestly, vertically, it might even be a bit taller. I was watching a YouTube video in landscape and I noticed that the notch does cut in very slightly, like maybe a pixels amount, but it is, once you notice it, it is kind of hard to unsee. And there isn't really anything being done with the screen real estate you get back anyways. I do wish there was like an option to put the battery percentage back in the status bar instead of having to go to Control Center to view it when I want to check how much my battery is left. I don't know how many people want to check their battery percentage all the time, but I feel like it's at least an effective use of the extra space you get with a smaller notch. And I guess overall, this is a really nice screen to have on a phone, but like the biggest upgrade I'd say was that 120 Hertz refresh rate, which has been on other phones before and iPad Pros. So I guess it was just about time that the iPhone got it. And yes, while that higher refresh rate does help the phone feel a lot snappier and a lot more responsive, there's also that level of optimization that Apple has just because they design everything from the software to the hardware. And at the core of this is the A15 Bionic, which actually, unlike past iPhone processors, there's actually 2 versions this year. So the regular iPhone 13 models have a 4-core GPU and the Pro models have a 5-core GPU. And that's really the only difference between the 2 chips. There's just an extra GPU core on the Pro models. And I don't think it enables any features specifically, since you do have those new camera features I mentioned earlier, like cinematic video and photographic styles available across the entire iPhone 13 lineup. But it does give you some more headroom for power, so this phone will feel fast for a little bit longer as opposed to feeling significantly faster than, say, like the iPhone 12. This phone has a 3095 milliamp hour battery, and honestly, it feels like it lasts forever. But even with all that power in the A15 Bionic, it's a flagship chip, you still have fantastic battery life on this phone because that, like I mentioned earlier, the optimization that Apple has over controlling hardware and software, they can make it work together really well. With what I considered heavy usage, like I was out all day, I wasn't on Wi-Fi at all, and I was taking a bunch of photos, I ended with about 10 to 15%, but on a more average day where I was connected to Wi-Fi most of the time, I had like 30% by the time I plugged in at the end of the day. And it's really convenient to have a phone this powerful but still last majority of your day if you're really pushing it. Maybe you plug in near the end, but I haven't had to charge during the day once. I mean, you do kind of expect iPhones to all perform really well and last really long, but like experiencing it is still just really impressive to me that they somehow managed to make a phone that's this quick, this powerful, it has the high refresh rate when you need it, and it still lasts all day. And I think the optimization and really tight integration between the hardware, which in this case the A15 Bionic, and the software, which is iOS, really helps this phone like feel fast, not just now, but also in a few years when it's a little older, but it's still getting software updates. They'll have plenty of power to continue to run newer features that'll be released in like iOS 16, 17, or 18. I mean, the iPhone 6 is still supported and able to run iOS 15, so having the amount of power that you do in the iPhone 13 Pro should keep this phone going for quite some time. Overall, it just works. Like everything from the ProMotion display to the new camera features, it just works as you'd expect it, like you'd expect from an iPhone. And it's so like integrated and optimized to really give you the best experience possible regardless of what you're doing. Like I've never experienced shutter lag on an iPhone, and I've never experienced like stuttery animations on an iPhone. And it's awesome when you have a really good user experience combined with some really solid features like you got on the iPhone. So it makes for a phone that's really good to use and like really enjoyable to use day to day, because it's gonna work when you need it to work, and it's not gonna like impair you in any way. Like it's not gonna get in your way. But is the iPhone boring? Yes and no. It really depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a phone that has a good camera, good battery life, and it's gonna have software support for a few years, then iPhone 13 Pro is like the perfect phone for you. You just want your phone to work. But if you're comparing to like those phones with like those wild specs, like the 100x space zoom, the 8K video recording, or 150 watt fast charging, then yeah, the iPhone's gonna feel pretty boring to you. It's pretty conservative, I'd say, in the specs and the features that it has, aside from the chip that's just insanely fast. But it is a pretty good phone overall, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it down below and subscribe for more videos about tech, cameras, and making. Here's a video that YouTube thinks you're gonna like the best, and here's a video about 3D scanning with an iPhone.